Uncomputable, Play and Politics in the Long Digital Age by Alexander R. Galloway. Published in November 2021 by Verso Books. Preface and Introduction. Read by the author. Preface. A letter from Paris. About 10 years ago, in the springtime, a few days after my birthday, I received a letter from a lawyer's office on the Rue Aubert in Paris, a street northwest of the Palais Royal near the old Garnier Opera. Letters from lawyers frequently bring bad news, and this was no exception. Quote, "I am writing to you in my capacity as legal advisor to Mrs. Alice Debord," the letter began, "the sole holder of the pecuniary and moral rights to all of the work of Mr. Guy Debord." In unadorned prose, the lawyer informed me I had violated Guy Debord's intellectual property. My eyes scanned across phrases like exclusive rights and non-authorized exploitation. As I would later learn, copies of the letter were also sent to my employer and to the director of a nonprofit organization where I had been an artist in residence. Guy Debord, the French filmmaker and author, was already fresh on my mind. At the time, I was spending my days and nights on a laptop, writing code for a computer game. Built in collaboration with a small team of coders and artists, the computer game was a restaging of a relatively unknown late work by Debord, a tabletop strategy game called The Game of War that Debord had made in the 1970s. The lawyer from the Rue Aubert was unambiguous. "Stop working on the game, or we will sue you for copyright violation." A claim of intellectual property infringement brought by the estate of Guy Debord is ironic, to say the least. This was a man who spent his entire career gleefully copying, sampling, and stealing from Hegel and Hollywood and everything in between. Thumbing through my dog-eared copy of The Society of the Spectacle, Debord's signature 1967 tract on culture and politics, I eventually found what I was looking for. Chapter 8, paragraph 207, line 2, an excerpt from Debord's theory of art. Quote, "Plagiarism is necessary. Progress demands it." To resolve the matter, I indulged in a momentary fantasy. I would simply respond to the lawyer with a few choice citations from Debord himself on the necessity of artistic appropriation, and that would be that. Anyhow, I had no intention of plagiarizing Debord or anyone else. Mine was a research project. I was reenacting a historical algorithm. Besides, what could be more boring than trying to hijack the master of détournement himself? I had worked on play and games in the past, but what captivated me most about Debord's Game of War was not the ludic element. What captivated me was the algorithmic element. Like other games, Debord's project is defined by an algorithm of sorts, its book of rules. The game has binary conditions for winning and losing. The playboard is a grid structure, not unlike a data array, or for that matter, a bitmapped image. Players must even perform simple calculations in their heads during combat. In a certain sense, the game was already a piece of code. Restaging the game in software was a relatively simple task. Less simple, though, were the mysteries unearthed along the way. Mysteries that I would eventually explore and ultimately try to solve. At the time, I knew I wanted to write about algorithmic culture and the history of computation. Not cybernetics in the narrow sense of Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson, but computation as a catch-all for the media of multiplicity more generally. Looking at Debord's game, I saw an algorithmic artifact, and I wanted to write a history capacious enough to include this project along with other artifacts more explicitly computational. Through a series of connected episodes, this history could delve into some of the precursors of cybernetics from the 1920s, or afterward, into the artificial life experiments of the 1950s. It could talk about networks, supercomputers, and black boxes. It could bring in other formats like weaving and sculpture. It could even try to make a case, perhaps outlandish at first thought, for how 19th century photography helped invent computer graphics. Although its intent was cease and desist, that letter from a decade ago was more of a beginning than an end. Debord's Game of War was merely the start of a story that continued well beyond it, into the very nature of the computable and the uncomputable. It set a whole series of things in motion for me, opening up new questions and suggesting a way forward. I had decided not to respond to the lawyer from the Rue Aubert. Instead, I decided to write a book. Introduction. This book is about the computable and the uncomputable. No general theory, I instead narrate a series of historical episodes. These stories are drawn from the archives of computation and digital media, broadly conceived. The goal is to show how computation emerges, or fails to emerge, how the digital thrives but also atrophies, how networks interconnect while also fraying and falling apart. Such alternations, something done, something undone, something computed, something uncomputed, constitute the real history of digital machines, from cybernetics and networks to cellular automata and beyond. And while computers have colonized the globe in recent years, they also excel at various practices of exclusion. The excluded term might be intuition, or it might be aesthetic experience. It might be the flesh, or affect. The excluded term might evoke a certain poetry, mysticism, or romanticism. Or it might simply be life, mundane and unexceptional. Uncomputable means all of these things and more. The gist is that there exists a mode of being in which discrete symbols do not take hold, or at least do not hold sway. And in the absence of such rational symbols, computation starts to drift and take on another form. Sometimes this is called the realm of life or experience. Sometimes it is called the analog realm. Yet, analog computers are some of the oldest computers. Meanwhile, the term uncomputable developed a series of other meanings, particularly in the 20th century. Two of them are about limits, rational limits and practical limits. To be sure, the resistance to rationality is as old as rationality itself. Nevertheless, a rash of rational paradoxes in the early 20th century culminated in a series of limits to rationality from within that very reason. Bertrand Russell's paradox from 1901, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, seemed to impose limits on what was possible within the theory of mathematical sets. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theories of 1931 showed that for any formal axiomatic system, there will always be statements that are true in that system, but not provable. Later, in 1936, Alan Turing demonstrated that it was logically impossible to calculate what sorts of machines will halt, given a certain input, and what sorts of machines will not halt. If before there were intuitive or poetic or biological limits to rationality, after Gödel, Turing et al., there were also demonstrable limits to rationality from within rationality. Indeed, in a certain sense, computation in the 20th century is defined more by the limits to computation, more by the uncomputable, than by a positive set of capacities. Or, as Beatrice Fazzi wryly put it, quote, "The founding paradox of computer science is that it is a field that is defined by what it cannot do, rather than by what it can do." Alongside the rational limit, there also emerged the question of practical limit. Ask cryptographers about the uncomputable, and they will respond, how much computing power do you have at your disposal? Can you afford to crunch the numbers until the sun burns out? Computability is thus also a strictly pragmatic question. Fields like cryptography excel at generating knots and obstacles within pure rationality, obstacles that greatly impede computation, even if they are not strictly uncomputable. Is it possible to reverse a hash function? In the abstract, yes, but practically speaking, no. At least so goes the promise of crypto security. If these are three types of uncomputability, analog life, rational paradox, and practical limit, a fourth meaning of the term uncomputable comes from the indiscernible and the indeterminate. In her book, Contagious Architecture, Luciana Parisi has written about entropy, chaos, contingency, indefiniteness, change, and what she calls patternless data. For her, the uncomputable already exists. It exists in the cracks and excesses of data, in interferences and contingencies, and how these things overwhelm seemingly impervious rational systems. Parisi was inspired in part by the mathematician Gregory Chaitin, who has shown that there are numbers with infinite complexity, meaning that they are, by definition, uncomputable. Digital computation traditionally has relied on discrete symbols, relied on them being discrete and remaining that way. When symbols start to dissolve, they pose a threat to computability. When a symbol cannot be fixed, it becomes more difficult to calculate. Or does it? Part of the story involves incorporating the indiscernible and the indeterminate into the very heart of computation. According to Parisi, error, indeterminacy, randomness, and unknowns in general have become part of techno-scientific knowledge and the reasoning of machines. Indeed, part of the history of computation is the history of the uncomputable being colonized by the computable. Claude Shannon, for instance, in 1949 defined information explicitly in terms of entropy. Since then, randomness and contingency have been incorporated into the body of computation, not excluded from it. 3D models are frequently textured using procedural randomness. Images are improved via anti-aliasing, essentially a form of aesthetic noise. And the empirical turn in AI has shown how contingent data is ultimately much more valuable than predictable determinate symbols. In a sense, randomness and contingency have become fully industrial. Today, the computable is closely intertwined with the uncomputable. Beyond the uncomputable as major theme, this book also engages a minor theme, the multiple. In the episodes that follow, the multiple will appear as cells, units, and pixels, plus their arrangement into sets, arrays, and grids. We will see multiplicity made visible in the first pixels rendered on a computer display, in artificial life simulations, in a tabletop game, and in several other media artifacts. We will explore multi-lens photography and the ability to create multiple images quickly and easily. Likewise, we will look at textiles built up through multiple strands, iterating lengthwise and widthwise, the warp and weft of yarn in 2 dimensions, mimicking the sets and arrays of mathematical formulae, and vice versa. Such formal constructions of the multiple, forging a unit, then iterating the unit in series, are at the heart of digital computation. Indeed, the multiple has long been a topic of concern. Anxieties about copies and originals go back to Plato, at least, and the modern period has its own relation to repetition and duplication. The serial novel, the multiple in art, the film strip, Walter Benjamin on reproduction, the post-structuralists on repetition. Multiplicity was already a buzzword in 1990s cyberculture. Harold Ramis even made a film about it in 1996. It bombed. Here, one might distinguish between formal and real multiplicity, to adopt the Marxist argot. Things may be formally multiple in that they may be duplicated or copied without much altering the integrity of the original, anxieties about the uncanny notwithstanding. Yet, the sort of multiple relevant in digital computation is real multiplicity. That is, the always already digital materiality of the monad, the set, the array, the molecule, the cell, or the crystal. For Euclid, arithmetical numbers were called plethos, originally translated as multiple, although the nearest English cognate is plethora. Numbers for Euclid were real multiples, nothing more than the rote repetition of a basic unit. Digital computation thrives in such conditions of real multiplicity. Yet other thinkers favor the multiple not for its arithmetical regularity, but in precisely the opposite sense, as a way to deviate from homogeneity and consistency. The work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari is exemplary in this regard. As they put it, multiplicity means becoming wolf, becoming inhuman, deterritorialized intensities. Multiplicity furnished Deleuze and Guattari with a deviation away from territory, away from the human, away from the Freudian ego, away from all manner of deterministic repetition. A similar promise resides in the adjacent term multitude, an old concept reinvigorated by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in a series of books including Empire, published in 2000. The multitude is a living alternative that grows within Empire, explained Hart and Negri. Composed of singularities, the multitude is not a simple array or regular grid, but rather an open and expansive network. This reveals a basic tension. In its tessellations and permutations, the multiple seems to promise difference and variety. At the same time, the multiple requires repetition, and thus always refers back to some elemental sameness. So, does the multiple entail the blank repetition of habit? Does it mean cloning? Or does the multiple disrupt and enliven, opening up new lines of flight, new modes of experience? Multiplicity, it seems, is rife with contradiction. Digital media studies is currently experiencing something of a golden age. Starting more than a decade ago, Mark Marino helped inaugurate a new field of inquiry dubbed critical code studies, a disciplinary shift evident today in scholarship from the likes of Rita Rayleigh, Adrian McKenzie, and Matthew Fuller. At the same time, a renewed interest in infrastructure has guided a number of important recent books, such as Nicole Staroselsky's The Undersea Network and Tungwei Hu's A Prehistory of the Cloud, both devoted to the real materiality of networks. Theorists like Yu Wei have recently explored the various philosophical nuances of digitality, fueled, in Wei's case, by the tech philosophy of Bernard Stiegler and Gilbert Simondon. Or consider Simone Brown's smart and timely Dark Matters, dealing with the technology of race, or adjacent work on opacity and queer computing from scholars like Zach Blass, Jacob Gabry, and Kara Keeling. While feminist theory has long engaged with digital technology, the recent Xenofeminist Manifesto, echoed particularly widely, due in no small measure to a series of staunch positions taken by the manifesto's authors on controversial topics such as alienation and posthumanism. At the same time, Martine Sims' excellent Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto provided a refreshing alternative to some of these accelerationist tendencies, stressing the mundane over the extraterrestrial. Even in the world of art criticism, computational and network aesthetics have come to the fore, exemplified by the wide dispersion of a pamphlet by the artist Seth Price, aptly titled Dispersion, or in a different way, by recent volumes on networks and participation from David Josselet and Claire Bishop. Several of these threads are brought together in Patrick Jagoda's Network Aesthetics, which looked across different media formats, from literature to film to games, and is focused equally on both digitality and formalism. Meanwhile, new alternatives proliferate. I am thinking of Home King's discussion of ambiguity and ambivalence in computational media, or Aria Dean's essay on memes and blackness, or Francois Laruelle's attempt to degrow philosophy from within, and with it, digital computation, through his so-called non-standard method. If the analog is about siding with the subordinate term, real continuity, life, affect, flesh, Laruelle's non-digital means not distinguishing between the analog and the digital in the first place. And if encryption obfuscates data, Laruelle's non-digital is more a question of compressing data, not hiding digital difference so much as undifferentiating it. A number of books already cover computation since World War II more systematically than I do. Books on cybernetics by Catherine Hales and Orit Halpern, or Fred Turner's account of the rise of digital utopianism toward the end of the 20th century. Not wanting to retread material better covered by others, I instead focus on stories not yet told, or at least not yet with enough detail. Stories of Niels Al Baricelli, Ada K. Dietz, and Francois Willem, stitching these stories together with more canonical accounts of figures like Ada Lovelace and John von Neumann. As a consequence, this history will be more episodic than systematic. We will jump around a bit, guided less by a mandate to be comprehensive than by the sometimes unpredictable logic of the archive. The book advances in loose chronological order, from the dawn of the 19th century up to the present day. We begin with photography and textiles, two technologies not always immediately associated with computation. Section 1 looks at the practice of chronophotography, or taking multiple photographs through time, focusing in particular on the strange history of the multi-lens camera. Section 2 shows how weaving and computation have long been intimately intertwined. Section 3, set before and after World War II, outlines the first digital computer age through what the Tikkun Collective have called the cybernetic hypothesis. Section 4 explores the question of artificial life by way of a series of early experiments in cellular automata. Section 5, on play and games, triangulates some of the political dynamics of the 1970s, including an incipient mode of asymmetrical antagonism, only fully investigated in Section 6 on the black box. The research methodology for this book, while largely consisting of typical archival research intermixed with more synthetic theoretical claims, also entails a rather different kind of knowledge collection. This new method, which might be provisionally labeled algorithmic research or even algorithmic reenactment, is gaining adherence today and will likely become more significant in the future. Operating under the assumption that code has its own story to tell, I decided to reanimate some of the inert algorithms found in various archives, doing so by recoding and rebuilding them by hand. Ultimately, the book is organized around 3 such reenactments: weaving the algebraic patterns of Ada K. Dietz from the late 1940s for Section 2, restaging the cellular automata simulations of Niels Al Baricelli from the early 1950s for Section 4, and programming Debord's 1978 Game of War to play on current software, complete with a rudimentary Debord AI for Section 5. Algorithmic research means a process of discovery in which computational artifacts are researched computationally. Consider the work of Niels Al Baricelli, discussed here in Section 4. If one were to begin studying Baricelli, it would be natural to consult the existing publications and archives, particularly the archives at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where Baricelli performed his most important work. Yet, these are essentially humanistic rather than computational research methods. So, in addition to immersing oneself in the archival record, one might also treat Baricelli's technical research as technical, producing new subsidiary software as a way to engage with the archival material. With these assumptions in mind, I decided to restage Baricelli's breakthrough 1953 experiment on my laptop. In order to rewrite and migrate Baricelli's 1953 experiment into today's software, I had to read his various white papers not simply as prose, but as technical documents. Baricelli's pseudocode had to be translated, rewritten, debugged, and made executable in today's software. This process was beneficial because it afforded a more intimate knowledge of the kinds of technical claims being made by Baricelli, not simply the kinds of philosophical and cultural claims evident in his writings. Likewise, I had hands-on engagement with the algebraic weaving patterns devised by Ada K. Dietz. While researching Dietz's various publications and news clippings, I also wove samplers of some of her designs, starting with the relatively straightforward AKD 230, and culminating with a reproduction of Dietz's more complex 8-shaft pattern AKD 62 SW. Working on the loom, trying out different fibers, experimenting and making mistakes, afforded a kind of practical intimacy with the material, beyond merely consulting and studying Dietz's book on algebraic pattern design. A similar spirit fueled the exploration into Debord. For a variety of reasons, both practical and intellectual, Debord's late project, The Game of War, had been mostly forgotten, earning little more than a page or a footnote in some of the books on Debord. Most of his chroniclers and critics preferred to focus on Debord's core creative and intellectual output, the films and the writings, with particular emphasis given to the heyday of the Situationist International. Nevertheless, piqued by the oddity of the game, I began work on a computer-based version of Debord's game, which would ultimately be released under the title Kriegspiel. Programming this piece of software granted unique access into Debord's brain, access unavailable via conventional research techniques. Indeed, only by rewriting and debugging Debord's code was I able to unearth a number of crucial details that affect the arguments given below in Section 5, some details of which even Debord himself was unaware. Digital research methods have been debated a great deal in recent years. I will save my commentary on methodology for the afterword. Suffice it to say that I do not refuse digital methods, even as many extant examples remain unappetizing. Likewise, I do not refuse critique, and consider the choice, critique or computation, to be both forced and false. My own efforts tend to be multimodal, writing code on the one hand and writing more traditional texts on the other. Along the way, the two activities inform each other. Building and coding cultivates an intimacy with the materials, while critical analysis reframes the object under inspection. My goal has never been to quarantine or subdue criticality, as some are wont to do. On the contrary, my goal has been to unify critical theory and digital media within a single project. What are the conditions of possibility for computational media? How and when did the digital age begin? I offer here a series of episodes drawn from the long digital age, not to overturn existing histories, so much as to extend and reorient them. As we will see, this supplemental history started earlier than might be expected, in the 19th century, but one could easily go back further in time, and continues to the present day, based on sources drawn from media, culture, technology, and philosophy.